It was almost midnight when the knock came. I was sitting in the living room, bathed in the soft glow of the television. The sound startled me, sharp and unexpected against the otherwise quiet night. 3 loud, deliberate knocks echoed through the small house, cutting through the sitcom laughter on the screen. At first, I thought I'd imagined it. Who would be knocking at this hour? The street outside was always deserted after dark, and I wasn't expecting anyone. Then it came again. Knock, knock, knock. I muted the TV, my heart racing. The sound was heavier this time, more insistent. My first instinct was to ignore it. Whoever it was, they'd surely leave when no one answered. But the knocking didn't stop. Knock, knock, knock. I stood, the unease settling into my chest like a weight. Who's there? I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. Silence. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. Something about the quiet felt wrong, unnatural. I approached the door slowly, each step making my pulse quicken. When I peeked through the peephole, there was no one there. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Was this some kind of prank? Maybe kids playing ding-dong ditch, though that seemed unlikely this late at night. Hello? I called again, louder this time. Still no response. Curiosity got the better of me. I unlocked the door and opened it cautiously, the hinges creaking in protest. The night air was cold, a sharp contrast to the warmth inside. My porch light illuminated the empty street, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. There was no one there. I stepped outside, scanning the quiet neighborhood. The street was deserted, the houses dark. Even the usual hum of distant traffic seemed absent. Hello? I tried one last time, my voice shaky. No answer. I stepped back inside, locking the door behind me. My unease lingered as I returned to the couch. Maybe it was just a random noise, a branch tapping against the siding, or the house settling. But deep down, I didn't believe that. I tried to brush it off, returning my attention to the television. But I couldn't focus. My eyes kept flicking toward the door, my ears straining for any sound. An hour passed, then 2. Just as I started to convince myself it had been nothing, the knock came again. Knock, knock, knock. This time it was louder, more forceful. My chest tightened as I stared at the door, dread pooling in my stomach. I didn't move. The knocking continued, each blow reverberating through the house. Knock, knock, knock. Who's there? I shouted, the fear evident in my voice. Still, there was no reply. I grabbed my phone, my hands trembling as I dialed my neighbor, Mr. Wallace, who lived 2 houses down. He was an older man, always up late. Maybe he'd seen something. The phone rang twice before he answered. Hello? Mr. Wallace, it's Alex. Did you hear knocking just now? Someone's at my door. He paused, his voice growing concerned. No, Alex. I haven't heard anything. Are you all right? I don't know, I admitted. It's probably nothing, but... The knocking stopped abruptly, cutting me off mid-sentence. Alex? Mr. Wallace asked, his tone sharper now. It's gone, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The knocking just stopped. Stay inside, he said firmly. Lock your doors and don't answer it again, no matter what. I double-checked every lock in the house, securing the windows and drawing the curtains. The unease was unbearable now, a constant pressure at the edge of my mind. I stayed up late into the night, clutching a baseball bat I'd found in the hall closet. But the knocks didn't return, and eventually, exhaustion took over. When I woke the next morning, sunlight streamed through the gaps in the curtains. For a moment, the events of the night before felt like a bad dream. But then I saw it. On the doorstep, just outside the front door, was a single black feather. The day passed uneventfully, but the feather stayed with me. I couldn't explain it. There were no birds that large in the area, and the way it had been placed so deliberately sent a chill through me. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the feeling of being watched returned. I tried to distract myself, filling the house with noise, music, TV, anything to drown out the oppressive silence. But as midnight approached, the dread grew stronger. And then, like clockwork, the knock came again. Knock, knock, knock. I froze, gripping the arm of the couch. The sound was unmistakable, louder and heavier than before. This time, I didn't bother calling out. I knew I wouldn't get an answer. Instead, I crept toward the door, my heart pounding in my chest. The peephole revealed the same empty porch, the street beyond bathed in the eerie glow of the street lamp. But as I watched, something moved. A shadow, faint and fleeting, crossed the edge of the porch. It was gone before I could process it, leaving nothing but stillness in its wake. I didn't open the door that time. Instead, I backed away, retreating to the safety of the living room. The knocking continued for another minute before stopping abruptly. The house was silent again, but the feeling of being watched remained. When I finally worked up the courage to check the door the next morning, I found another black feather. This time, it was accompanied by something worse. A message scrawled in jagged letters on a piece of torn paper. "You shouldn't have opened the door." The message rattled me. "You shouldn't have opened the door." I turned the piece of paper over in my hands, searching for some explanation. It was damp, the ink smeared in places, as though it had been left out in the elements. My mind raced with questions. Who had left it? How did they know I'd opened the door? And then there were the feathers. Black, sleek, and unervingly large. They were too deliberate, too purposeful to be random. I stood on the porch, staring out at the empty street. The morning was crisp, the sun bright, but it didn't calm the unease that had taken root in my chest. I was being watched. I could feel it. That night, I didn't feel safe. I locked the doors and windows again, checked every corner of the house, and kept the curtains tightly drawn. But the sense of vulnerability lingered. By midnight, I was pacing the living room, unable to sit still. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the house settling made my heart race. When the knock came, I nearly dropped the glass of water I was holding. Knock, knock, knock. I froze, my body tense. My eyes darted toward the door, but I didn't move. Then it came again, louder this time. Knock, knock, knock. Go away. I shouted, my voice shaking. The knocking stopped. For a moment, silence filled the house. But then, from the hallway behind me, came the sound of footsteps. My blood turned to ice. I spun around, gripping the glass like a weapon. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The hallway was empty. The dim light from the living room barely reached the end of the corridor, leaving the far corners cloaked in shadow. I stepped forward cautiously, my bare feet silent against the wooden floor. The air felt colder as I moved down the hall, my breath fogging in front of me. And then I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, just beyond the reach of the light, stood a figure. It was tall and still, its form shrouded in darkness. "Who are you?" I whispered, the words catching in my throat. The figure didn't move. It didn't speak. It simply stood there, watching me. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding. My foot caught on the edge of the rug, and I fell, the glass slipping from my hand and shattering on the floor. When I looked up, the figure was gone. The hallway was empty again, silent and still. But the air felt wrong, heavy with something unseen. I scrambled to my feet, my breathing ragged. My first instinct was to run, to get out of the house and never come back. But where would I go? And what would I say? That I was being haunted by shadows and feathers? The phone rang, cutting through the oppressive silence. The sound made me jump, and for a moment, I debated whether to answer. But the thought of ignoring it felt worse somehow. I picked up the receiver with a shaky hand. "Hello." A pause. Then, a voice I didn't recognize. "You shouldn't have opened the door." The line went dead. I didn't sleep that night. When the sun finally rose, I grabbed my jacket and left the house, desperate for some semblance of normalcy. I walked down the block to Mr. Wallace's house, hoping he'd have some advice, or at least some reassurance that I wasn't losing my mind. The old man opened the door with a concerned look. "Alex, you all right?" "No," I admitted, my voice cracking. "Something's happening, Mr. Wallace. I don't know how to explain it, but—" "Come in," he said quickly, ushering me inside. Over a cup of coffee, I told him everything. The knocks, the feathers, the message on the doorstep, the figure in the hallway. I expected him to laugh or dismiss it, but his face grew more serious with every word. "Did you open the door the first time it knocked?" he asked finally. I nodded. Mr. Wallace let out a heavy sigh. "I was afraid of that." "What do you mean?" "There's an old story," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Something my grandmother used to tell me when I was a boy. She said there are spirits that knock at your door, testing you. If you answer, you invite them in." "But there was no one there," I said weakly. "That's how they work," he replied. "They don't come all at once. They creep in, piece by piece. First the knocking, then the signs. And by the time you realize what's happening, it's too late." I stared at him, my stomach twisting. "What do I do?" Mr. Wallace hesitated. "You can't ignore them anymore. They've already started, but you can find out what they want, if you're brave enough." I left Mr. Wallace's house feeling more confused than ever. His words echoed in my mind as I walked back home, the weight of the situation pressing down on me. When I stepped inside, the house felt colder than before, as if something had seeped into its walls. I glanced toward the hallway, half expecting to see the figure again, but it was empty. For now, I knew Mr. Wallace was right. I couldn't ignore this anymore. Whatever I'd invited in, it wasn't going to leave on its own. I had to confront it, no matter how terrified I was. That night, I sat in the living room, the lights dimmed, waiting for the inevitable. Midnight came and went, and the silence stretched on. For a moment, I thought it might be over. Then the knock came. Knock, knock, knock. I stood, my legs trembling as I approached the door. This time, I didn't bother looking through the peephole. I already knew what I'd see. With a deep breath, I unlocked the door and pulled it open. No one was there, but lying on the doorstep was a third black feather, along with another message. "It's inside now." I stared at the message, my mind racing. "It's inside now." The words felt heavy, almost alive, pressing down on me like a physical weight. My hands shook as I picked up the black feather, its sleek surface cold to the touch. The door creaked as I stepped back inside, locking it behind me. The house felt different now, darker, heavier. The walls seemed to close in, the air thick with an oppressive energy. I placed the feather and note on the coffee table, as if keeping them in view would make them less threatening. But deep down, I knew the truth. Whatever I had let in wasn't bound by locked doors or daylight. It was already here, somewhere in the shadows. The hours crept by, each second stretching into an eternity. I sat on the couch, gripping a flashlight like a lifeline. Every sound made me jump. Creaks in the floorboards, the faint hum of the refrigerator, even the rustle of the wind outside. But the worst part was the silence. It was too deep, too unnatural, as though the house itself was holding its breath. At some point, I must have dozed off because when I opened my eyes, the clock on the wall read 3:13 a.m. The living room was pitch black, the flashlight in my lap flickering weakly. And then I heard it, a soft, dragging sound coming from the hallway. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound was faint, but unmistakable, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. Slowly, I stood, my legs trembling beneath me. The flashlight's beam wavered as I aimed it toward the hallway. The light barely reached the far end, illuminating only the edges of the walls. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cracking. The dragging sound stopped. The silence stretched thick and suffocating. I took a cautious step forward, the flashlight shaking in my hand. And then I saw it. The figure from the night before stood at the end of the hallway, its form barely distinguishable from the shadows. It was tall and impossibly still, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Why are you here?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it began to move slowly, deliberately, gliding toward me without lifting its feet. The dragging sound returned, louder now, reverberating through the house. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. "Stay away!" I shouted, my voice echoing through the empty house. The figure stopped, its silhouette barely visible in the dim light. And then, in a voice that wasn't entirely human, it spoke. "You let me in?" The words were like nails on a chalkboard, grating and hollow. My pulse thundered in my ears as I backed into the living room, my grip on the flashlight tightening. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it reached out, its hand stretching toward me. The shadows around it seemed to ripple and writhe, growing darker and more menacing. And then it vanished. The room was silent again, the oppressive energy lingering in the air. I collapsed onto the couch, my heart racing. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. The phone on the coffee table buzzed, the sound shattering the silence. I stared at it for a moment, dread pooling in my stomach. With shaking hands, I picked it up. A new message appeared on the screen. "It's watching." My blood ran cold. I glanced around the room, half expecting to see the figure standing behind me. But the room was empty, at least as far as I could tell. Another message followed, the words filling the screen. "You can't hide from it. You brought it here." Tears welled in my eyes as I typed back. "What is it? Why me?" The response was immediate. "It's not just you. It's been waiting. You opened the door. It chose you." I dropped the phone, my hands trembling. The next morning, I returned to Mr. Wallace's house, desperate for answers. He opened the door with a look of concern, ushering me inside without a word. "What's happening to me?" I blurted out, my voice frantic. "It's in my house. It's following me." Mr. Wallace sighed heavily, gesturing for me to sit. "I was afraid of this," he said. "These things, they don't come for no reason. They're drawn to something, weakness, fear, guilt. Have you done anything recently? Anything that might have opened a door to it?" I thought back to the first knock, to the moment I had opened the door without thinking. "I answered the door," I admitted. "I didn't know." "It doesn't matter," he interrupted. "You invited it in whether you meant to or not. Now it's bound to you." "Bound to me? How do I stop it?" "You can't," he said grimly. "Not completely, but you might be able to appease it, to understand what it wants. If you don't, it'll consume you." I left Mr. Wallace's house with more questions than answers. His words echoed in my mind as I returned home, my steps heavy with dread. When I stepped inside, the house felt colder than ever. The shadows seemed darker, the silence more oppressive. I knew it was here, waiting for me. The phone buzzed again as I entered the living room. "Are you ready to listen?" I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. Slowly, I typed back, "What do you want from me?" The response came almost immediately. "Everything." The lights flickered, and a chill swept through the room. The shadows seemed to grow, creeping closer, surrounding me. The figure appeared again, this time standing in the center of the living room. Its form was clearer now, its eyes burning with a cold, unnatural light. "You let me in," it said again, its voice a haunting echo. "Now you belong to me." The room plunged into darkness. The darkness was suffocating. I couldn't see anything. Not the walls of the living room, not the figure standing before me, not even my own hands. But I could feel it. The air was heavy, charged with an energy that pressed against my skin, making it hard to breathe. And then, in the void, I heard its voice again. "You opened the door. You invited me in. Now, you must pay the price." The words were colder than the air around me, each syllable reverberating inside my skull. I tried to speak, but my voice caught in my throat. "You don't belong here anymore," it continued, its tone growing sharper. "This is my home now." "No," I whispered finally, forcing the words out. "This is my home. You can't take it from me." A low, guttural laugh echoed in the darkness, sending chills down my spine. "Foolish," it said. "You think you have a choice?" The air around me shifted, the darkness twisting and writhing like a living thing. Shapes began to emerge, vague, shifting forms that seemed to watch me with unseen eyes. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice trembling. The figure stepped closer, its silhouette towering over me. Its eyes burned with an icy light, piercing through the darkness. "I want you," it said simply. "Your fear, your soul, your place." I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "No, I didn't mean to let you in. I didn't know." "You knew enough," it interrupted. "You opened the door. You gave me permission, and now there's no going back. The shadows pressed closer, their cold tendrils brushing against my skin. I could feel them pulling at me, dragging me toward the figure. No! I screamed, struggling against the invisible force. You can't fight me, it said, but you can make a bargain. The pulling stopped suddenly, and the darkness seemed to recede slightly. The figure loomed over me, its form flickering like a flame. A bargain? I asked, my voice shaky. Yes, it said. I will let you go, but you must give me something in return. What do you want? It tilted its head, the movement unervingly slow. A piece of you, your fear, your pain, your memories. Something to sustain me. I hesitated, my mind racing. What would it mean to give it a part of myself? What would I lose? And if I don't? I asked. The figure leaned closer, its icy breath brushing against my face. Then I will take everything. My heart raced as I considered my options. I didn't trust it, but what choice did I have? The shadows were closing in again, the air growing colder by the second. Fine, I said finally. Take what you want. Just leave me alone. The figure straightened, its eyes narrowing. Very well. The darkness surged forward, enveloping me completely. I felt a sharp, searing pain in my chest, as though something was being ripped away. Images flashed through my mind, memories of childhood, moments of fear, fragments of dreams. When the darkness finally receded, I was on the floor of my living room, gasping for air. The figure was gone, and the house was silent once more. For a moment, I thought it was over. The air felt lighter, the oppressive energy gone. But as I stood, I realized something was missing. I couldn't remember my mother's face. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I could recall vague details, a laugh, a scent, a feeling of warmth, but her face was a blank void. The phone on the coffee table buzzed, breaking the silence. My hands trembled as I picked it up, dreading what I might see. The message was simple. I took what you gave me, but I'll always be watching. I dropped the phone, a hollow ache settling in my chest. In the days that followed, I tried to rebuild a sense of normalcy. The house felt empty, but the fear had subsided. The knocking didn't return, and the shadows no longer lingered in the corners. But the memory of that night stayed with me. Every time I passed the front door, I felt a chill, as though something was waiting on the other side. I moved out a month later, hoping distance would bring peace. But even in my new apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. And sometimes late at night, I hear it again. Knock, knock, knock.